This is the business of Africa. If it's about Africa, then it's our business, bringing big and small business issues right to your doorstep. Liberation Day tariffs introduced by U.S. President Donald Trump are, according to some sectors of society, reshaping the global trade order. Tariff or not, we are made to understand that the cost of intermediate and final goods will increase for consumers worldwide. From the mountain kingdom of Lesotho to the Horn of Africa in Ethiopia, we explore how countries on the continent can navigate these times with the aid of the African Continental Free Trade Area, among other instruments. Andrew Mashanda is head of Africa Regions and Offshore Business and Commercial Banking at Standard Bank, which hosted the Africa Unlocked conference held in July. And one of the themes that they were seized with is the trade wars. What is at stake for Africa is the question that was asked. Mr. Mashanda, thank you very much for your time on the Business of Africa podcast. It is often impressed upon us that Africa is not a country. Help us understand the trade landscape on the continent pre-Liberation Day, and if we look at the picture regionally or holistically.
Thank you very much for having me on your program. It is a great pleasure to be here to talk about our very important continent. If you look at the trade picture across Africa, pre-liberation as the term that you used, is you've got a continent which is riddled with quite a lot of infrastructure challenges, which the governments have been investing quite heavily in improving. There are significant governance and policy issues in each of the geographies that need to be worked on to improve the tariff regimes that exist amongst ourselves. So, of course, a lot of the narrative has been around the tariffs that America, some of the countries outside of Africa have imposed on Africa. But we also this is the time, no better time than now for us as a continent to look internally in the continent and look at ourselves and say, how can we make it easy for ourselves to trade with each other? I'll give you a statistic. So of all the intra-Africa trade, only 16% of the intra-Africa trade is actually taking place amongst ourselves on the continent. And what is causing that problem? We've got issues with tariffs between ourselves. We've got logistical issues. We've also got other non-tariff barriers, such as documentation requirements for environmental sort of requirements that are not harmonized. Policy is not harmonized across borders. So a very challenging environment for ourselves to do business with each other that we've created. But what we've seen amongst a lot of the businesses, particularly through the engagements that we have with them as a bank, is that our clients are beginning to find ways of, navigating through some of these challenges, painfully so, but it is happening. But the pressure we are facing from the geopolitical tensions globally is really putting pressure on us as the business community, the financial services community, and government to look at how we can make doing business, trade across Africa a lot easier.
And what are some of the ideas that are emerging in terms of looking at how to make trade easier on the continent?
So I think what we've seen is that there are certain regional blocks that have found natural flows in terms of movement. So if you look at East Africa, for instance, a lot of the East African flows go through Kenya. So you find that there's a natural flow of goods, services across Kenya. And from our side, we've come up with a solution called Borderless Banking, which facilitates the payments environment. We've also partnered with fintechs across the African continent who are also involved in payments like Flutterwave, Cheaper Cash, and so on, that are looking at actually improving the payments landscape intra-country, within each country and across borders. And we've also followed the payment trends as well that are taking place where people are moving away from the traditional forms of payment such as cash, electronic payments, card, to more instant account-to-account payments that we've seen with instant money taking off in South Africa. That's the one. The other initiative, obviously, is our participation in the G20. South Africa's chairmanship of the G20 is particularly critical, and for our positioning as Africa Unlocked conference, it plays very nicely into the themes that South Africa has adopted for the G20 summit and the chairmanship, which is being handed over later in the year: solidarity, equality, and sustainability, which is a reflection of South Africa's commitment for inclusive economic development, which is exactly what we're talking about. Is inclusivity requires us to open up our borders and allow for free flow of trade to take place across our borders here.
with that thought of opening up the borders, you speak of intra-Africa trade being at some 16%. In enters the African Continental Free Trade Area with the solutions that you provide as a bank, for instance, the borderless banking that you speak of. What is it that you have witnessed in terms of the fitness of purpose of the African Continental Free Trade Area in boosting intra-Africa trade, in promoting Borderless Africa? And we'll get into why Borderless Africa is important, but what is it that you have observed?
I think one of the things we've observed is that being able to facilitate payments across borders, it also helps you understand what people are trading across borders. So we've seen a lot of movement of oil and gas, refined product, particularly within the East African community. So what you then see is that with the oil and gas developments in Uganda and the pipeline that we built through Tanzania, you can actually start seeing a trend emerging as to how East Africa can start working its way towards regional interdependence when it comes to oil and gas and the trade of petroleum products within. Because right now what we're seeing are the flows of imported petroleum into the region, coming across borders, using our payments platforms such as Beyond Borderless Banking to demonstrate the fact that, so that there is a raw material that we've got underground that needs to be developed. And when it's developed, it will actually create more interdependence. So our job is to then make that information available to the authorities and to government to make sure that as they start thinking of their national development plans, that they start appreciating that the development of payment systems internally within each country and across borders also become quite critical for ease of trade. The second thing is also our involvement in the discourse that's taking place around the non-tariff barriers that we have. Is how do we harmonize, rationalize, and in some cases eliminate some of the unnecessary, documentation requirements, most of which have actually become irrelevant if we are talking of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. Thank you.
What are non-tariff barriers?
So if you look at the customs regimes that you've got, so you want to import, maybe agricultural produce from one country to the other. So the harmonization of sort of non-tariff sort of barriers is what are the requirements of one country in terms of documentation? Is it phytosanitary certificates, customs certificate? What type of documentations are required in terms of the way the products, so the produce has been put together, the certificates of origin from one country to the other, the transportation, the quality of transportation, because you get harmonization of those things across borders. It makes it easy for people trading in those commodities to know exactly what they need to put together to be able to get their goods moving, smoothly across the borders. We've seen cases, and I could go into some detail, but we've seen cases where clients have tried to export one commodity from one country to the other. 3-4 months later, that same truck or the same container is stuck at the border because there's one piece of paper or other that's missing. And those are the non-tariff barriers that I'm talking about that just need to be eliminated.
Because then what is the consequence, I guess, of that? When you have a truck that is sitting 3 months later, disruptions to supply chains as well, I guess maybe what is the consequence of having these barriers?
The consequence of having these barriers is that if you're dealing with small to medium-sized enterprises, they operate on very short cash cycles that we as banks intermediate and facilitate. So any delay in the movement of stock, because they're dealing with either cash or goods. So if the goods are not converted into cash in a timely manner, you end up with a situation where the trader themselves run out of cash to actually operate. So it does have a direct impact on the liquidity of the entities that we are trying to finance. So it does slow down the economy. It reduces and slows down the velocity of the movement of liquidity of cash within any economy when goods are stuck at borders, when there's a disruption in terms of supply chains and there are logistical challenges that make it difficult for goods to move as quickly as we want them to move, because the movement of goods will be followed by the movement of cash.
It would also sound, or rather a takeaway that I am hearing is that the bank is trying to offer solutions here, and the bank is trying to develop along with the continent of Africa. One of the themes that was touched on in the conference was that of a narrative, right? And telling your own story. And one of the participants said, well, Africa, tell your own story, which is what you opened with. We need to, this moment in terms of the Liberation Day tariffs has invited us to really look within and to change within. Why is that important for the bank?
I think it's important for the bank. I mean, if you look at us, often when people look at us, they think of us as probably a single jurisdiction entity. We are a bank that is invested across 21 countries in Africa, and we still have international centers in Dubai, London, Beijing, New York, that help us facilitate, the flow of pools of capital into Africa. So we've got sources of capital that are aiming or looking at the development of the continent. And it is our job to work with the players in the industry and governments to actually open up pathways for that flow of capital to find a home in some of these investment opportunities. So for us, we do play a role in terms of identifying actually sources of capital. And we also feel that we need to play a role in making sure we create an environment within Africa with our partners and our stakeholders that creates an environment where those pools of capital find, fertile ground where they can generate good returns and also help us develop our continent. So we've got trade finance products that we have that help us with particularly imports and exports across borders. We also have contract financing products in most of our markets that allow us to finance, to give SMEs financing or cash while they are waiting for contracts to be executed. Also, sometimes they do invoice for work, some of the larger corporates, and they need cash to be able to continue with their operations. We can actually offer cash against those invoices through products we call invoice discounting. So we have continuously responded to the needs of our customers across the entire value chain to just make sure that we're continuously allowing the velocity of money to continue to flow within each of the economies, within each country, each jurisdiction, and across borders. And that's the value that our network has given us, and that's the value that we've transferred to our client base.
What are Liberation Day tariffs, or rather this moment? What is it inviting us to do as a continent? I ask because you highlighted some, or rather in painting a picture of the trade landscape on the continent, you mentioned that it's littered with infrastructure problems, incoherent policies, and you say the time is now to look internally. And so from the conversations that you are having with policymakers, from the conversations that you are having with some of the governments on the continent, does it appear that the needle is shifting? Because, Mr. Mashanda, you speak to people on the ground and there is a sense of, and I say this carefully, lack of hope, but you sit in the room where these conversations are being had. Should we maybe be condemning reasonably with a thought in mind that it's going to take us some time? How long, we're not sure, but the groundwork is being done. So when we speak of infrastructure problems, incoherent policy, what is it that you are seeing? Are we shifting the needle? Are you being heard as a business?
I think we're being heard, but I'll also use an example of a game-changing transformation that we've seen, say, in a country like Nigeria. Probably a few years ago, if you went into Nigeria, it was possible that you would walk into Nigeria and find that there would be fuel queues in a country that is on record the largest producer of oil and gas. Mm-hmm. Aliko Dangote has gone and developed a refinery which produces 650,000 barrels a day. And what that's done for the Nigerian economy is that it's actually localized the value addition for oil and gas. And it's reduced the drain that oil and gas, petroleum sort of products were having on the foreign currency of the country. So what you're beginning to see is an entire sort of value chain being developed within a country, and the dynamics of oil and gas changing. The supply chains have been taken from being largely, Nigeria exporting crude oil out into the world to Nigeria consuming its own crude oil in its own country, using a refinery that's been built in the country and supplying its own people and neighboring states. And it's changed the dynamics of logistics of oil and gas movement across the the west coast of Africa. So again, it shows you it takes time. Yeah. And these are not overnight sort of developments, but these are developments that demonstrate what's happening. Afreximbank has come up with the Pan-African Payment System initiative. Again, they are responding to the need for us to create payment systems that allow us to move money across borders, which allows the flow of goods and services. So again, that's another initiative which is at a multilateral level, and various governments across Africa have been heavily invested and involved in the development of this Pan-African payment system. Okay. And we've seen more and more of these initiatives coming through that are enabling us to do integration. They do take time, but we are seeing some changes and some shifts taking place. Cross-border investments by family-owned businesses. If you look at East Africa, West Africa, South African corporates that have gone out of South Africa and invested on the continent, and some entities out of Africa have come back and invested in other markets across the region as well. So we are seeing it, and we are facilitating we're advising a lot of businesses as they start moving their businesses across. We are also advising the businesses that are also coming into Africa that want to invest on the continent. We've got an Africa-China corridor, which is also quite active. We've been actively involved in facilitating the trade and the investment by Chinese businesses on the continent. So it is happening slowly, but it is happening.
Encouraging. It takes time, and it also takes intention from what it is that we are hearing. We spoke about a borderless Africa. Why is that important, if at all?
It's extremely important. I think if you go historically, you'll find that in most culturally and in terms of probably the tribal connections, in most of our markets, borders themselves are a creation that was not natural or indigenous to the African continent. So you'll find that in most markets, and I'll give you a good example. I mean, at some point in my career, my family and I lived in Malawi. Mm-hmm. Between Lilongwe and Blantyre, there's a road that separates Malawi and Mozambique. That road has not actually separated the cultural ties, the trade ties that exist. So people simply cross the road. To them, the border that has been defined by the road doesn't exist. So for us, as we think about it from a regulatory point of view, we do find ourselves in a situation where the borders have been created. Is how do we get ourselves back to the indigenous systems of trade that we had before that allow for the free flow of goods amongst ourselves that actually follow our cultural sort of dynamics and the heritage and history. So we do see borderless as something that really belongs to us, and we need to now facilitate that process of getting ourselves to a point where we can do it in an orderly manner, have the right level of documentation and right level of processes to protect each other as we trade with each other. So that's how we see it.
Yeah, I think you've maybe answered the question of, because seeing the theme of the conference, Africa Unlocked, business shaping Africa's tomorrow, I wondered, is it a key that's going to unlock the continent? What does it look like? Is it biometric? Is it your traditional key? And what I'm hearing, I guess, essentially from you is that you and I are the keys that are going to unlock this continent. Fair to say?
Absolutely fair to say, because ultimately, at the end of the day, if the development of Africa is not people-centered, if the development of Africa is not transformational and doesn't create a better continent for generations to come, then we're doing it purely for the purposes of entertainment. But the reality is we want transformational change that will create a better future for generations to come, that will allow for the free flow of trade, that will allow the development and the growth of Africa to be owned, driven, and championed by Africans themselves.
Mr. Mashanda, sir, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much for availing yourself for the business of Africa. Andrew Mashanda is head of Africa Regions and Offshore Business and Commercial Banking at Standard Bank. Thank you very much for tuning in to the Business of Africa podcast, where we bring big and small business issues right to your doorstep. You'll hear from us again in the next fortnight, God willing. Bahaichu. Pula.